From Brisbane by Andrew O'Neil. He's a professor of political science and head of the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. Give us a scene setter, if you will. Talk to us a little bit about the lead up to this. How's it being reported on there? What does security look like for somebody like yourself trying to get around Brisbane?
Well, the Brisbane Central Business District is what many would refer to as a ghost town, essentially. It's in lockdown. Police and army personnel are focusing very much on maintaining a security net in and around the Central Business District. Outside Brisbane itself, outside the Central Business District, life is going on pretty normally in the suburbs, but you know, Brisbane is very much in lockdown for this event.
You just heard Tom Barton's report pointing out that there is still a great deal of anger in your country over MH17. More than 24 Australians, of course, perished on that jet when it went down. Give us an idea of the level of anger there. How is that going to play into all of this? Do you think, I know Prime Minister Tony Abbott's been very vocal about his feelings. Of course, Vladimir Putin's there. What do you think that's going to do in terms of this G20 summit?
Look, I think like a lot of international summits and certainly like previous G20 summits, non-core agenda items will intrude into the discussion. That's inevitable. It did last year with Syria at the St. Petersburg summit, and it will again this year. The extent to which Vladimir Putin is held to account, not just on MH17, but also in relation to Russia's destabilization activities in Ukraine, I think will be something to watch. And I think a lot of that will, you know, we won't see. That will be very much in the domain of private talks among the leaders themselves. But it's pretty clear that there is some genuine grassroots dislike, some quite visceral dislike of Vladimir Putin's role in this, essentially making it a lot more difficult to undertake an immediate investigation of the crash site and forensic investigation that could have led to the recovery of more remains, including of Australians who were killed in that accident.
As you mentioned, a lot of those will be private discussions. Let's talk about the public persona of what's going on out in public. What do you see as the top priority items at this year's summit?
I think the Australian government has focused very much on narrowing the G20's agenda. We've heard previously that climate change is off the agenda as far as Tony Abbott is concerned. I think he's certainly going to, you know, he's going to take a lot of heat on that, and he may well take some heat on that in private discussions as well, particularly on the back of the US-China climate change deal, which has got enormous coverage around the world. So Australia is looking a little isolated on the issue of climate change, to be frank. I think what the government's done, though, is to try and really narrow down the agenda to a few key issues. Economic growth, for example, the target of 2% growth in each G20 country over the next 5 years. Members have signed up to that. Mapping out how that will be achieved, I think, is going to be a key, a key assignment for heads of government over this weekend. A second issue that Australia is focused on in constructing the agenda is money laundering, anti-money laundering legislation, the need for greater transparency and information exchange among G20 countries to make it much more difficult for those who would avoid taxation has been a big issue as well. And finally, the issue of really, in a sense, mapping out an agenda for the developing world. There are 193 countries in the international system. The vast, overwhelming majority of them are not represented at this summit. So there is a lot of pressure, there are a lot of expectations on the G20 members that they will chart a course to assist and to promote and to facilitate economic growth in the developing world. So these are the leading economic countries in the international system. You know, there is a very strong moral expectation that they will provide leadership for the remainder for the rest of countries in the international system who aren't represented at this summit.
Andrew, we're just about out of time. I do want to ask you one final question. In years past, there's been a lot said about how these summits really don't produce much except very expensive photo ops. Is that likely to happen this time around, or will we see really concrete things coming out of this one?
Look, I think what we'll see is a very focused communique. I think that will reflect the fairly focused agenda that Australia has put together. There'll be a lot of what's known as core business issues, that the core business of the G20, essentially macroeconomic and microeconomic in the area of infrastructure, for example, but largely macroeconomic messaging to the rest of the international system. And I think the key to emphasise here, though, is that no matter what the leaders come up with on the basis of earlier agreements between finance ministers and central bank governors, that were meetings that were with, it will whether those commitments are implemented will depend on the political will of each leader when they return to their country to drive this through in terms of domestic legislation. If that doesn't happen, if there isn't the commitment at the domestic level for each G20 country, then I'm quite pessimistic about whether the agenda, whether the communique will ever be implemented. But let's wait and see. I think what we will see, though, is I think we'll see a much more focused communique than we did, for example, in St. Petersburg in 2013.
Andrew, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your insights. Andrew O'Neil joining us from Brisbane.